For people outside of the industry, for those who only have a surface level understanding of how things really work, it's always incredibly easy to look at a product and say that something just doesn't seem to work, and thus the game sucks, it's not fun, and I'm going to bed. There's obviously some valid criticism in there. The customer pays for a product and wants to have a good time with it, no matter their past experiences or where they stem from. They've bought something, and if they don't get the experience they were hoping for, and then there's an incredibly low chance that they will become returning customers in the future, or even just consider spending any more time and or money on a game that an entire team of hardworking programmers and artists might have spent several years on, with tons of blood, sweat, and tears having gone into it. I feel the need to mention this because, as obvious as it may be to you, the listener, viewer, right now, people generally just gloss over this fact. To tie into that, there's an obvious need to mention the extremes of customers that a game might ultimately attract. For established franchises, there will always be the one big side of the customer base that's either entirely new or merely passing by, where they might not even be into the material but decided to give it a shot to see what the hype is all about. Imagine someone whose main interest is sports ball, but they wanted to try out knitting or weavery. This is the first attempt, and in turn, they will be a first-time customer for anything related to knitting and weaving. But there's an incredibly low chance that they'll be returning customers at some point in the future. On the other end, there's the extreme of extreme elitism. People who have found such an incredibly big interest in a game that they decide to dedicate their entire online personas around it, starting social media careers with it in mind, or in some fringe cases even taking it to the big stage with professional video game athletes. To tie back into the knitting allegory from earlier, these are the people that have already mastered the basics to some degree. They might go out of their way to engage in a more advanced way, with advanced knitting stuff, looking up tutorials online to find out what's all possible with a ball of yarn and a needle. They're sure to spend their time with the hobby, but only as much as they might personally feel is worth their time and energy. This is incredibly important to keep in mind, respecting the customer's time, energy, and additionally, the money they've spent on the product. Sadly, a lot of the second extreme that I've mentioned usually falls into a toxic little trap, which leads to glorified little doom bubbles. Going away from knitting again and returning to the world of video games, someone who's mastered a game and is seeking further challenge is obviously usually going to find themselves in a position where they might have to come up with personal rules to spice up their gameplay. Other times, something like a mod exists to add a little of variety to the game, such as randomizers. This is how it used to be, with a few exceptions such as mutators allowing people to customize their playthroughs of Halo, for example. In today's age of live service gaming, where the game that you might have bought 10 years ago no longer resembles the product that you currently own, this becomes an incredibly touchy subject, especially with that extreme elitism in mind. This part of the customer base is the most vocal one, as I've mentioned. They are the ones usually at the forefront of campaigns that demand change. Sometimes these changes might entirely be valid. For example, the entire Star Wars Battlefront 2 Pride and Accomplishment drama. An incredibly embarrassing thing to happen to an otherwise generally very okay Star Wars FPS game. But in some cases, in very, very rare little cases, there might be a problem which everyone is able to point at from one angle or another. However, trying to explain what exactly the problem may be about? That's where people have problems, and where modern game developers can make an incredibly big mistake. Overcorrection. Listening to the community and compromising your initial ideas. Going out of your way to suit an audience that might not entirely know what they actually want. This video is about Payday 3, if you haven't quite noticed yet, by the way. In the Payday YouTuber space, as well as the general Payday community as a whole, there have been a lot of posts and videos trying to tackle the subject of armor. It has gotten to a point where just talking about the issue has become incredibly annoyingly boring and bland, as no one is really able to add anything new to the topic. I've decided, with the help of my bestie, my he-bestie even, that I would like to take a step back, and instead of talking about how the armor system is unfun, I would instead go ahead and talk about why the armor system is unfun, and why Armor 2.0 possibly won't fix said issues after being delayed for seemingly over a year. With that in mind, I would also really like to keep things on the shorter side, just to value your and my own time. That's why I'll leave out the part where I talk about Armor 2.0, as it's not out yet, and would just end up being major speculations and voicing annoyances that might not even come true when it eventually comes out. Essentially, this video is about how the whole system of armor in Payday 3 is needlessly complex for something that has been done before, better, and let the focus be on other more important things, such as gunplay, enemies, or even just the maps themselves. I've spent way too much time on Payday 3, especially considering I don't even like it all that much. And I think that shows which part of the community I am in. At the same time, I'm also not someone who sits at the forefront demanding changes to be made just to cater to my needs specifically. I just don't like hopping on bandwagons. What I want from Payday I've mentioned in the past. Co-op. That's what I bought the game for initially. It's what Payday 2 basically lacks entirely. Just starting from the beginning already, when you look at the combat as a whole in Payday 3, they've designed it with death by 1,000 cuts in mind. In case you're unable to make anything of that, the basic idea is that your resources are limited and that you eventually run out and miserably die. Something like that sort of already exists in the previous games, through the down mechanic as well as the heavy focus on ammo economy in the first game. While armor was constantly regenerating in the previous two games, allowing you to take constant, calculated risks that might reward or punish you depending on your luck and skill. In the third installment, the armor system changed, and almost immediately became a constant point of criticism and complaints. Especially at launch, but even with the initial introduction of adaptive armor and the consumable slot, the player found themselves constantly being pressured by systems entirely outside of their control. What I mean by this is that every enemy is hit scan. When an enemy shoots you, you instantly take damage. This isn't any different in many other games, but there's an issue with this execution specifically. If I get shot in something like Call of Duty, I'll peek into cover, wait out the bloody screen, and continue on with my life. If I get shot in Payday 2, I'll do the same thing, but instead of waiting on a bloody screen, I'll instead wait for my armor to regen. If I get shot in Payday 3, depending on the armor that I'm wearing, I could lose an entire plate on the highest difficulty in 2 shots without being able to do anything about it through skillful counterplay. You are constantly losing, even when you don't think you are. This is incredibly frustrating, and since day 1, there was no use for medic bags or ammo bags outside of just wanting to feel special. A very basic skill setup basically pushed everyone into constantly running armor bags, as it was the single most stressed resource in the entire game. It just turned into a second health bar, giving you 2 health bars to constantly keep an eye on. To add to this frustration, ammo and health as stressed resources were almost entirely worthless. If you had armor, your health would basically not get stressed unless a certain mutator was active. Armor piercing. Armor piercing rounds was a mutator that existed for a tiny bit and would damage both your armor and your health with every shot that you took. This added further frustrations on top of the already annoying armor system. Outside of that, the few sources of direct health damage are specials. Specifically the taser, or zappers as they call it now, cloakers, and the nader with his nader gas. These, as sources of health damage, would work fine if not for the fact that they're very easy to counteract. You basically need to worry more about being shot by something that you can't dodge, rather than a cloaker which you can hear and react to in time, a taser who 9 times out of 10 won't even be able to reach you.
No, like,
You just shoot them in the head, and that's it.
no, they can't even hit you.
Or a nader who you kind of just avoid. While I understand the idea of what they were trying to do here, as I said, I'd rather have an armor bag to counteract the fact that normal enemies can just deal permanent damage to me without me being able to do anything about it, other than shooting them first, and if I failed, crying to myself, very gently. As for ammo, well, you basically would never run out of ammo even if you tried, and 4 skill points let your magazines turn bottomless. This makes an already bad problem even worse. There was an attempt at one point in trying to take steps towards fixing the ammo economy issue. This, however, was met almost immediately with an incredibly huge backlash from the loudest parts of the community, which went as far as sending death threats towards the game director at the time. What a lot of people failed to acknowledge during this glorified hate mob campaign is the fact that the frustrations came from a place of no communication and sporadic updates, mixed with zero content alongside the skill itself being removed. Side tangent and sort of a fun fact, I guess. When said game director left the company, I made an incredibly tongue-in-cheek Reddit post about how the cyberbullying campaign essentially worked. I wanted it to read as an insult targeted specifically at the worst parts of the community and partially Starbreeze, reminding them that they started a harassment campaign and that Starbreeze basically admitted that cyberbullying works. This post, however, was then picked up by said game director, who then posted it on their Blue Sky as an example of how vile the community really is. I only ended up finding out several months later, and I apologized to them on Blue Sky, as it wasn't my intention to add any further fuel to the fire held against them. Instead, trying to appeal to the greater consciousness in people and reminding them that they were a little too harsh and maybe got a little distracted, especially considering that Mio was working in an incredibly disjointed and stressful environment at the time. Going back on topic, we've established the 3 pillars that Payday basically works off of: ammo, health, and armor. There's the idea, which was mentioned a lot in talks with developers, about how the greater gimmick of Payday 3 is to be as quick and as efficient as possible. If you want everything to work out perfectly, you should be using everything at your disposal to get things done fast. Stealthing sections, using your tools, using cover, finishing objectives as quickly as possible when things get loud, possibly coordinating back throwing to save time, and picking the right favors. Not everyone likes this constant source of tension, however. Being forced to also push on ahead simply gets incredibly tiring and exhausting quickly. Some people, especially the older ones, loved the high-stakes shootouts of old, pushing from cover to cover, taking their time, and generally playing a little slower. By going for the glorified speedrun the heist or die concept, the developers essentially alienated a huge part of the already established Payday player base. Constantly seeing your armor being shredded to a point where you can pick up a plate and immediately lose it 5 seconds later without any regenerating damage buffer to fall back on is just frustrating and tiring. There is no skillful counterplay outside of just killing the person that's already locked onto you with perfect aim and hitscan weapons. In something like Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2's DMZ side mode, the player has finite armor plates on top of a regenerating 100 HP health pool. It has hitscan enemies with perfect aim, which reload, on top of a constant player threat. And somehow, that system works 10 times better than Payday 3's system ever did. It's both simple, intuitive, and works well with everything else the game has to offer, including an ammo scarcity at certain points during engagements. At some point, I probably should have mentioned that enemies in Payday 3 just do not reload at all. They never have. Why do they not reload? Well, Mio, the former game director that I've previously mentioned, was in a stream together with Mario in the Top Hat, which you might know from Payday meme fame. Initial alpha playtesters for Payday 3 found cops constantly streaming reloading to be quite annoying and tiring. So instead of, I don't know, working around it, lowering the amount of lines that they would say, lowering the chance of them actually saying reloading, they took out the reloading mechanic entirely. This is a common pattern you'll see from Starbreeze when it comes to fixing problems that this game has. We'll use this as an opportunity to mention that Armor 2.0 is needlessly complex and won't fix any of the other issues the game has. let's go away from the attrition a bit and talk about difficulties instead. Payday the Highest offers easy, normal, hard, overkill, and the final difficulty of overkill 145+. Easy only exists for a few heists. Normal is accessible but still challenging. Hard is a slight step up, and overkill is a genuine test of teams. While the game isn't perfect and has blatant balancing problems, I feel as if the difficulty is done the best here. I haven't mentioned overkill 145+, as it was mostly made as an additional challenge for the loudest parts of the player base, which I mentioned in part 1 of this video. It's not very fun, but technically still builds upon the foundation that is Payday the Heist's very solid base game mechanics. Payday 2 offers normal, hard, very hard, overkill, mayhem, death wish, and death sentence, plus the additional 1-down mutator, alongside other mutators that most people might not even know exist, honestly. Payday 2's difficulties are rancid, they're awful, there are too many. Normal, hard, very hard, and overkill are essentially the same difficulty, while mayhem, death wish offer the best challenge and difficulty, only to be dragged down by the incredibly inconsistent product that is Payday 2 as a whole. Death sentence sucks. It's not about it being incredibly challenging, it's not about how it would attract some of the most jobless individuals imaginable. It's just an incredibly poorly made difficulty that basically devolved into upping numbers to a sickening degree. It's the result of appealing to that loudest part of the community, much like Overkill 145+, but somehow 10 times worse. Payday 3 wanted to do something new with difficulties, and in theory, I think they've learned a lesson from the previous games. Health values are the same across normal, hard, very hard, and overkill. This is a good first step. This, however, is almost immediately invalidated by the fact that most of the changes are damage dealt, accuracy, and enemy amounts. I understand that higher difficulties should obviously be more difficult, but number tweaks are just incredibly cheap. The increased damage and increased accuracy together on higher difficulties just sour the fact that enemies are hit scan and don't need to reload. The bulldozer is the absolute worst example of it. On normal, he might as well not exist. On hard, he might be a slight nuisance. On very hard, he might even be able to break a plate. On overkill, his drawback shotgun kills you in 2 shots. He doesn't need to reload, by the way. But they thought of that. Kind of. His gimmick is that he taunts you, and the player can use the taunt to damage him or run away from him. In theory, that sounds nice. In practice, he never actually taunts until the entire team is already dead. The threat of the dozer is then almost immediately reduced to nothing due to the fact that overkill weapons like the Lynx sniper rifle exist. It 2-taps the dozer to the body and can shoot through walls, while a built-in threat detector puts a box around all enemies while you're looking through the scope. The dozer just doesn't seem to work with the finite armor system in mind at all. All it takes is a double special mutator dozer combo to take out all your armor plates. After that, if you manage to save yourself, you're forced to deploy an armor bag, or use a consumable if you have the skill to restore the base chunk. Once you're completely out of armor bags and armor repair kits, you find yourself in a death spiral. And death spirals are something you want to avoid, and it's incredibly anti-fun. It doesn't add anything to the gameplay, especially when the game itself leans more into arcade. It does kind of make sense in something like GTFO or Tarkov, but not Payday. Once you consider everything that I've mentioned up until now, maybe it's slowly starting to make some sense that the skill system, which I should mention was made in 2 weeks, might be a big part of why Payday 3's armor system just doesn't seem to work. A lot of it was made with this armor system in mind to accommodate it. I hope that it also makes just as much sense when they mention the fact that bringing back the previous armor system, the regenerating armor from Payday the Heist and Payday 2, would have come with a couple of problems of its own. It wouldn't fix any of the issues tied to gun balance, difficulty balancing, or the issues with how enemies simply aren't distinct enough from another. The bulldozer needs to stick out more, for example. The color palette on him, he looks just like any other heavy. I hate it so much. Game development is difficult. So difficult that I simply do not feel qualified to offer fixes to the problems at hand here. For some things, I absolutely can. I would like to slow the game's pace down a little bit. I would like to encourage people to stick together a lot more. I want to let people have the little power trips, but I want these power trips to be rare and to be focused on more than just one player. I want things such as traps that players can set. Trip mines and turrets are a good start, for example. Intelligent placement of mission objectives, being able to lock doors to create choke points. Those are things that would make this stale game 10 times more interesting, and put a much larger emphasis on something that I believe it desperately needs. A reminder of what it is. A 4-player co-op shooter. Starbreeze heard concerns from the community about armor, and at first, they stuck to fixes that didn't compromise their initial vision. But instead of working on what's around the system, such as, for example, something incredibly simple as a regenerating little damage buffer, which technically is in the game but just not active, they decided to overcorrect with needless gimmicks to entice the players to possibly give the game another shot, even though the entire update might just end up falling by the wayside, with no one really acknowledging any of the extra additions about 1 week after Armor 2.0 actually releases. But maybe, just maybe, I will have to give it an honest shot. Maybe, just maybe I might end up liking it more than I thought. But also maybe, just maybe, my concerns are going to be validated by the update. We will have to wait and see. I will just have to trust the plan. Thank you for watching, and I hope that I've managed to add some additional points to the discussion of how Payday 3's launch was inherently flawed, and that we can take a look into the future with additional problems to point at when it comes to the general issues that the game's core structure has. And as always, take care of yourselves.